Well, thank God for everything. Thank you for inviting me to come and share with you. Um, Thank you for your patience. I'm not accustomed to preaching to American audiences anymore, and sometimes I wonder if I use the right words. But you all smiled at the right places and laughed at the right things, so I guess you understand my English. Last night we talked a bit about the fact that the God who is the Ancient of Days, the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, is also a God of newness and freshness and creativity. He delights in giving us new opportunities and new ideas and new approaches and new joys and new blessings. You have already learned in this missionary conference that what I said to you is true. Even the presentation we had this morning was a wonderful example of new things that God is doing. And I'm sure as you've been in the other sessions, you've been hearing that God is a God of new things. In this session, I want to talk a bit more about a new focus in missions work. Of course, we all realize that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is the gospel. Yeah, that doesn't change. Our faith is anchored firmly in that. However, in my understanding of traditional missions, I believe that God, at least in some areas, is changing the focus a bit from traditional approaches that at least I was accustomed to when I was your age. It seems like some of these things they're not necessarily new. Some of them are very old, but they're being recycled. We kind of lose the focus on some of these things, and we have to rediscover them. I say they're not new because we see evidences of these things in the Bible. The point I want to make is that I believe missions is much different. At least the missions that I'm exposed to is much different from what it was 30 years ago, or at least what I was exposed to 30 years ago. Perhaps I will reveal my ignorance of being out of the country for 26 years. I've never been out of Nigeria longer than 2 months in the last 26 years, so I may not have a complete feel of what's going on here. I want to begin tonight with a story from the life of Jesus. If you'd like to turn to it, it's Luke chapter 9, verse 1. It's when I read it to you, you will know it's a very well-known story. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, "Take nothing for your journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave the town. If people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave the town as a testimony against them." So they set out and went from the village to village, preaching the gospel and healing people everywhere. May God bless the reading of his holy word. Well, I don't know if this is a good text or not for modern missions. I suspect that even short-term missionaries take an extra tunic with them. I brought an extra tunic all the way from Nigeria with me. However, there are some key truths in this passage that I would like to share with you. Perhaps the most important task that Jesus had to do, apart, of course, from providing the atonement for our salvation, was to prepare his disciples to implement his teachings and way of life. It was good for Jesus to believe what he believed, to do what he did, but if there was no reproduction of those things, it would have just been a little flash of goodness across the history of the world and would have been gone. So he felt it necessary to invest a lot of time in his disciples to prepare them. In fact, he had been preparing his disciples for a couple of years. He had been teaching them the various things they needed to know. He had been modeling for them things that were important to them. As a good teacher, Jesus knew that his students needed more than just information. They needed more than just modeling. They needed experience to be prepared for the task that was before them. Things look different in the field than they look in the classroom. I'm sure you could say amen to that. Things look different when you are doing them than when somebody else is doing them. So, what were these disciples going to do? Jesus was sending them out on a field project. It was like a student teaching exercise. It was a practicum. They were to take what he had taught them and put it into practice themselves. Now, the method of teaching in those days was sort of true mentoring. You simply followed the master around everywhere he went, and you just were exposed to him 24 hours a day. So if he prayed, you learn how to pray. If he counseled, you learn how to counsel. If he taught, you learn what he taught and how he taught. And that's just kind of the way it was. Students did this they learned by listening to his speeches, by asking questions, by observing the way he responded to situations. However, again, you could only learn so much that way. You had to practice. When I was in high school, I learned how to put roofs on houses. And when I started college, the minimum wage in those days was $1.65 an hour. But I learned how to put roofs on houses, and I made a good bit more than that. I even trained a whole lot of people how to put roofs on houses. One of my star students, I don't know if he's here tonight, but is he around? Was Dr. Alan Brown. He worked for me. He was my employee. And when I taught somebody how the first time they got up on the roof, I would say, okay, you sit over that bundle of shingles, and all I want you to do is just watch me. Don't do anything but watch. So I would just whack away at those shingles, and after a while, I'd say, okay, now I'm going to explain. You see, you put this thing in here, and you line it up on this line here, and you put a nail here, 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 and here. You got that? Da, 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 da. So I do that 2 or 3 times. I'll say, okay, now, are you ready to try? Yeah, they're ready. So now you're going to work, and I'm going to watch. And it was always kind of interesting because they never did it right the first time. They would put it in there, and it would be crooked. I would pull it up and throw it off the roof. Say, let's try again. And they would keep working, and after a while, they would get to, it was fairly straight, and so we'd just watch a little while, and I'd go back to work and watch them, and every once in a while, I'd have to come over and say, no, can't do it that way. No, you put a nail there, and, after a while, they gradually caught on, and then they had to work on their speed, because, I was paying them $2 an hour, but I was making $3 or $4 an hour on them, and so I wanted them to increase their speed. That's the way it works. My daughter is a physician. She's just gone through an intensive internship, and this is the way medical doctors are trained. They do a lot of classroom work, but most of that work is just working and observing first, and then participating a little, and then participating more. And eventually, you get your own license, and nobody's watching you again. This is the way it went in those days. And so I want to focus on 2 key aspects of this statement that Jesus made to them about as he prepared to send them out on this teaching practice. The first might be called the prerequisites to their ministry. Jesus said some things need to happen before you can effectively minister. Take nothing for your journey, etc. We read that. Now, why did Jesus give such strict and narrow instructions? I mean, it's pretty strict instructions. Don't take any extra clothes. Don't take any food. Don't take any money. I mean, you couldn't even have a quarter in your pocket to call back home. It was pretty difficult. Well, I think a couple of observations. He wanted to test their faith about believing God. I mean, you know, are they able to trust God to take care of simple things like this? I think he also perhaps wanted to test their people skills. This was not just about trusting God to supply their needs. This was also about using their ingenuity and creativity and personal relationships to see if they could get their needs satisfied. Let me explain this a bit more. Though going without food and extra clothing sounds like a kind of a radical approach, it really wasn't. This was an extremely hospitable society. All you had to do is just show up, and if people see that you're a stranger, they're going to take you in and feed you. And the Semitic culture until today demands that you take care of strangers. So in our eyes, it sounds a little rough, but really it wasn't too bad. However, there is a specific statement that I find remarkable in this statement that Jesus makes. He says, if people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave their town as a testimony against them. Now, what was Jesus really saying here? I'm afraid that we often focus on the wrong part of that instruction. We tend to focus on the dust part. You know, shake that dust. And, you know, if they don't accept you, well, just forget it. I'm leaving you. And we actually do see an example of this in Paul's life on his second missionary journey. When he got to Antioch, he had a rough time there, and they were driving out of the city, so he went out there and just shook the dust. I don't know how you do it, but they figured it out. However, I find another part of this story equally fascinating. Perhaps Jesus was suggesting here that they should work hard at developing good relationships with people who were their target audience. He was telling the disciples that if they did not quickly establish a proper rapport with a target audience, they're wasting their time. Are you hearing what I'm saying? He was saying that it's difficult, if not impossible, to reach out to people who do not like you, or who are suspicious of you, or who do not respect you. And if you run into a situation where they don't like you or don't respect you and there's no hope of recovery, you just leave. Because you're never going to do any kind of successful ministry to people who don't like you. This is probably it's maybe a strange point, but something I've discovered that's important in missions work. That means that one of the prerequisites to successful Christian ministry, including Christian missions, is to develop a positive relationship with the people you are attempting to reach. Now, let's take a biblical example of this. Paul was in Philippi. He cast demons out of this demon-possessed girl, and her owners didn't like it, and they brought him before the magistrates. They threw him in prison. This prison guard, the chief jailer there, these are just routine thugs. He knows how to deal with them. So he oversees the good beating that they get, and he locks them up. There seemed to be, the people were really angry, so he put them inside and not just locked the door, but put them in chains. Just routine day's work for the good Philippian jailer. However, two strange things happened that night. Number one, about midnight, he heard something he usually didn't hear. He heard singing. You don't hear singing in prison much. Singing implies happiness, joy. When you're singing, something is bubbling inside. Prisoners don't sing like that very much, just spontaneously. That was new to him. And shortly after the music, the place started shaking. And there was an earthquake. And he jumps up and he sees the doors are all open. And he sees the chains have fell off. Being an honorable person, he knows what's going to happen. If anybody escapes, he will have to suffer the penalty that that person would receive. So he says, well, you got to do what you got to do. And it's more honorable to die by your own sword than the shame of the other. So he takes his sword and he prepares to kill himself. And then he sees a strange thing. He sees this man, Paul and Silas. They say, please, sir, no, don't hurt yourself. We're all here, not just us, but we convinced everybody else to stay. There's no reason to hurt yourself. That was even more shocking than the singing at midnight. And we all know he fell on his face and said, what must I do to be saved? You know, he didn't ask that question the day before. These are just ordinary crooks, so let's beat them. But something changed his attitude. Something caused him to ask, what must I do to be saved? And I tell you what, you don't have to be much of an evangelist to lead somebody to the Lord when they ask that question. You see, there was something positive. There was something attractive. Men who sing at midnight when their back is bleeding from a beating, and men who do not run away whenever they have a chance, and not only that, but they keep everybody else and say, no, don't hurt yourself. We're all still here. That's what got his attention. He was attracted to them. They made themselves attractive. Now, this has to do with a word you may not hear in your theology classes, I'm not sure, but it has to do with public relations. Do you realize that public relations is a very important part of Christian work? It's a very important part of missionary work. Do you realize that one of the most important responsibilities of a missionary is to learn how to make himself attractive and appealing to the people he's ministering to? Do you realize that good public relations is just as important in a missionary as good theology? It doesn't really matter how much good theology you have if nobody listens to you. The Apostle Paul says, I've become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. To the Jews, he would dress like a Jew, he would eat like a Jew, he would talk like a Jew, he would laugh like a Jew. To the Gentiles, he did the same thing. He would dress like them, he would eat like them. He was just, I'm sure he's more comfortable on the Jew side, but if he's ministering to Gentiles, he can make them happy as well. He set aside his own personal preferences in order to win these people to himself, knowing that if he didn't win them to himself, he could never win them to Christ. Let me give you a specific illustration from Nigeria. Nigeria is roughly divided between Christians and Muslims. We have 160 million people in Nigeria. About half of them are Christians, half of them are Muslims. Few traditionalists thrown in there. I've done a lot of projects with Muslims. I work closely. I teach in a department of religion and philosophy, and so we have about a third of our staff are Muslims. I see them every day. We're in meetings together. We visit each other. I've worked hard at developing good relationships with Muslims. So they talk to me and tell me their views of Christianity. And do you know what the typical view of the typical Muslim of the typical Christian is? I will tell you. In northern Nigeria, number one, Christians are drunkards. Many states, 11 states in northern Nigeria have Sharia, some version of Sharia. Sharia is Islamic law. And of course, in Islam, they do not drink alcohol, and so alcohol is prohibited in 11 of our states in northern Nigeria. And guess who complains? It is, of course, the Christians. It's the Christians who smuggle alcohol in. It is the Christians who promote and demand alcohol. So Christians are all drunkards. Number two, Christians are immodest. If you come to my university, which is a public university, about 10% of our students are Muslims, and all of our Muslim girls are dressed very modestly. They would fit right in here, except they cover their heads properly, so only you can see their face. But our Christian girls, they were cheated by their tailors on both ends often. It is the Christian girls who dress provocatively. And so, of course, Christians are immodest people. Christians are immoral people. We have satellite TV all over Africa now. And satellite TV has movie channels, and 90% of these movies come from America. And they show nudity, and they show people hopping in and out of bed with each other's wives and non-wives, and sometimes wives with wives. And of course, everybody knows America is a Christian country. So Christians are immoral people. Christians are violent people. We have lots of conflicts in Nigeria. I could tell you about a lot of them. Within a mile of my house, 7 churches have been burned, but a mosque has been burned. And there have been dozens of mosques burned within 5 miles of my house. And hundreds of Muslim businesses and Muslim homes, and thousands of Muslims have died at the hands of Christians. So Christians are violent people. If you were a Muslim, would you want to become one of them? Perhaps sometime, people sometimes ask me about evangelizing Muslims. What do you do about evangelizing Muslims? Well, I start at a different place than you start with other people. That's the point I want to make tonight, and at least at this point. We have to start our missions work at a different place. How can I invite this person to be a Christian when he thinks he's going to become a drunkard, immoral, immodest, violent killer? Who in the world would ever want to become one of those? So when people ask me that question, I often disappoint them and say, no, I've never presented the 4 spiritual laws to a Muslim. So what do? I spend time with my Muslim friends. We do HIV/AIDS work together. We travel together. We travel in the same vehicle. We celebrate Ramadan together sometimes when we're traveling. We have PhD seminars in my department, and I go to all the Muslim ones, and I read them more carefully than I do the Christians, so that I can critique them more carefully, so that I can help them. When it's possible, I help them get U.S. visas. I visit them when they're sick, and when their members die, I go to their homes and pray with them. I've even given them money when their houses have been burned down by Christians. I hope you understand. What I am attempting to do is what I call image evangelism. They're not ready to be converted. What needs to change is their image of Christianity. I work with one young man. His name is Umar Farouk. We've gone so many places and traveled dozens of times together. And doing HIV work, I was with him one time, and we wanted to do a little video promotion. So we went down to the mosque to shoot some scenes at the mosque and in the mosque school that he was teaching in. And while we were at the mosque, I did a little interview. And unfortunately, he has all his Muslim friends standing around. And so I asked him with the camera rolling, Umar, what is it like working with Christians? And he got this big smile on his face. And he looked at me, but he was really talking to his friends who were standing around listening to the interview. And he said to me, you wouldn't believe it. They're better than we are. He said, when we couldn't raise money from our Muslim wealthy people, the Christians helped find money to train our people. And he went on and he gave several examples like that. They're better than we are. I said to myself that day, maybe Umar Farouk will never give his life to Christ, but one thing I can tell you, his children won't hate Christians. He'll grow up saying nice things about Christians. I'm attempting to change the image. And I think that in our world today, this is the new starting place, at least in some groups. I would guess there are thousands of Muslims in the city of Cincinnati right now. And I would guess if you would become friends with them and you would ask them what they think of Christians, the story they would tell you would not be too far different from what my friends have told me in Nigeria. That Christians are drunkards, they are immoral, they're immodest, they don't listen, they're arrogant, they're stupid. And so it is your job to show them that is not true. That Christians are loving people, they're intelligent people, they're thoughtful people, they are forgiving people, they are people that reach out to others. You don't even have a right to ask them to become a Christian until you can demonstrate to them that you are better than their Muslim friends. You understand a little bit more now why Jesus said, well, you know, if they don't accept you, just shake the dust off. Just leave. Just go on. You're not going to do any good. If you haven't established enough rapport with those people that they invite you and welcome you into your home, forget trying to help them. I hope that's clear. Is that clear? Here's one other small challenge. Certainly the purest form of human living in this world was in the Garden of Eden. You want to know what God really wanted human beings to be like? Well, it's probably the Garden of Eden's the place to look. Now, if you want to look at the purest form of Christianity, I could be wrong about this, but I suspect if you looked immediately after Pentecost, you would see the purest form of Christianity. These people have been filled with the Holy Spirit. They have not gone long enough for them to become perverted and derailed about various things. And so let's look at the description that you see shortly after Pentecost. There are about 5 different places in the book of Acts where Luke stops and gives us a summary of what is happening. The first one is in chapter 2, verse 42, and there's another one in chapter 3, and then they're fairly long, and then they get shorter and shorter. Here is the first one of those descriptions. I'll read it to you very, very quickly. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship and breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe and many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give anyone who had need. That's a pretty pure form of following Jesus, wouldn't you say? Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts, not just on Sundays. I mean, these people were meeting every day. They broke bread in their homes. They ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God, enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added the number of the daily those who were being saved. This was a beautiful church, a worshiping church, a fellowshipping church, a church that was teaching and learning, a church that was regularly meeting together. But there is a little phrase in there I read over kind of quickly. Did you hear what is said? They were praising God and enjoying the favor of all people. What? Can you repeat that? They were doing what? I didn't hear you. Let's say it like Africans. They were what? Have you ever noticed that phrase before? In the purest form of Christianity, there was something attractive about this faith. And even those Jews who were unbelievers said, we like those people. We enjoy being with them. We want to know more about these good people. And when you have such an attraction, it's not easy for the Lord to add to the church daily. Of course, it's true that this did not always last. There's been a lot of persecution in the church. But I find it fascinating that in the purest form of Christianity, people were immediately attracted to those people. To the extent that we can win the favor of people, and to the extent we can demonstrate the love and purity and joy of the Lord, to that extent we are laying a very important foundation for successful evangelism and mission work. To the extent that we excuse ourselves and that people are repulsed by us because we are too holy or they are too worldly, we are bypassing our responsibility to be attractive to people. Too often in the past, we have had a rather harsh, don't care attitude. Bless God, this is the truth. I don't care what you think. Well, you should care what people think. Because if you don't care what people think, they're not going to care what you say. And if what you say is important, you better care what they think. The point that I'm making here is that the new thing that I've been learning in the last 20 or 30 years is that our mission work must have a new starting place. We do not start by just winning people to Christ. We start by winning them to ourselves. Does that sound strange to you? It's only though as they see something attractive in us that they will accept that which we believe and practice. Hope that is clear. Let's move on to a second key phrase in this commissioning that Jesus gives to his disciples as they're going out for their student teaching practice. When Jesus gave his disciples these instructions, he told them that their practicum was to be a reflection of what he had been doing. In fact, according to Luke 9:2, Jesus said that when they went into the field to implement their projects, they were to do two things. They were to preach the good news of the kingdom, and they were also to heal the sick. These two phrases represent two kinds of ministries that Jesus had developed in the months leading up to this point. Let's talk about those two kinds of ministries. Preaching the gospel of the kingdom and what else? Healing the sick. The first ministry Jesus did was a ministry of communication that focused to a large extent on Jesus' philosophy or theology. It was primarily a teaching about the kingdom, which was different from the kingdom that they anticipated. So it took time to make sure they understood the differences between what they were expecting and what was going to be reality. Immediately after Jesus' baptism and temptation, Matthew tells us from that time on, Jesus began to preach. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. Mark begins his description slightly different. It says they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. Since the disciples did not know this information, Jesus had just to spend a lot of time explaining things to them. Jesus came to introduce a kingdom that was going to be different from what the disciples and the multitudes were expecting. Therefore, he had to spend just a lot of time with them doing that. All throughout his ministry, Jesus was teaching about the kingdom. At times, he devoted large blocks of time, the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse. At other times, it was just sort of a little bit here and there, and he would heal somebody and make a comment or confront someone. Preaching and teaching the truth, it was a very important part of his ministry, and it is a very important part of our ministry as well. This institution, one of the major focuses of this institution is to teach people how to communicate the truth. We have courses on teaching, courses on preaching, on homiletics, on many different aspects of communication. And it is a very significant part of any kind of ministry, and it is certainly an important part of missionary work, communicating the truths that Jesus taught and lived. On the other hand, Jesus was not just a teacher. He did not deal only with ideals and information. When Mark describes the first time that Jesus taught in the synagogue, he tells us that there was a demon-possessed man there, and Jesus rebuked that demon and delivered that man from demon possession. That was not teaching, that was action. He left that synagogue and went a few meters away to Peter's mother-in-law's house and found that the woman was sick. She was sick with a high fever, Luke tells us. Interestingly, Mark and Matthew tells us he had a fever, but Luke said she had a high fever. You know, Luke was a physician, and he was a little bit more careful in his descriptions. What did Jesus do? He healed this woman so that she was able to immediately get up and start serving them. These were only the first of many practical ministries in which Jesus engaged. In addition to healing the sick and casting out demons, Jesus did many other things. He raised the dead. He helped pay taxes. He fed the hungry. He interacted with children. He counseled the confused. He assisted with income generation. He assisted the homeless. He relieved the embarrassment of the disgrace. He became friends with the most rejected. He defended the abused. I believe that in some sense of the word, all of these things can somehow be summarized in that word, he healed the sick. The word healing there is therapeuo. We know that word quite well. And I think in all of those situations where Jesus was counseling, where he was assisting, where he's helping people pay taxes, he is addressing some practical problem, some need that they have, some lack that they have, and he is helping to solve that problem. He is healing whatever that problem was that they had. And so Jesus had these two kinds of ministries. a ministry of teaching, preaching, communication, information. He also had a ministry of practical assisting people. Don't be diverted by supernatural. I mean, not everything Jesus did was supernatural. Most of those healings were indeed supernatural, but many of these things were not supernatural, where he counseled people, he helped people, he reached out, he supported those people. These are the two kinds of ministries we see in the life of Jesus, and this is what Jesus sent out his disciples to do, to replicate what he was doing. Yes, preach the gospel like I do, but also heal the sick and support people in all these practical ways like I do. When people have multiple responsibilities, it's hard to keep them in balance. We tend to focus too much attention on one or the other. For example, I'm a husband, a father, a son, a brother, a preacher, a university lecturer, international organizational director, a board member, consultant, writer, a bunch of other things, and it's very difficult for me to get them all done. I tend to do the ones that I like to do. I don't like to mark examinations, so I postpone it as long as I can. But eventually you have to bend down and do it. But if you ask me to preach, I will do that quickly because I enjoy doing that. It's difficult to keep things in balance. How well was Jesus balanced in preaching and teaching and healing the sick? I was curious about this, and I did a little exercise some time ago. It's not a very sophisticated exercise. It's not necessarily a serious exegetical tool. But what I did is I counted up all the references to where Jesus, it said he was preaching and teaching. We are told that there were 62 references to Jesus teaching, not counting the 45 that refers to him as a rabbi or teacher. And there were 14 times we're told Jesus preached, for a total of 76 times. I also looked at the word heal. And the word heal is associated with Jesus 58 times. And the word touch, where Jesus touched somebody or somebody touched Jesus for healing purposes, is used 29 times for a total of 87 times. And so it's kind of interesting to me that Jesus is described as teaching and preaching just about the same number of times he is described as healing or touching somebody. I found that interesting. I did another little exercise that is even, don't try this one because your teachers of exegesis will be embarrassed. But ever since I was a child, I've been impressed by the red letters in the Gospels. The red letters, of course, are what? The words of Jesus. And so the black letters are what? They're everything else. They're sort of the deeds of Jesus. And sometimes they introduce the words. So I went through these things and I counted up the black letters and the red letters. It took me a while. I'm a fast typer, but not a very fast counter. For example, I discovered that in Matthew, 60.2% of that book is red letters. So what does that suggest? Matthew stressed the teachings of Jesus. On the other hand, in Mark, only 44.5% of his content is red, which means that he stressed more the actions, the deeds of Jesus. When you take them all together, 51.9% of the Gospels is red, and whatever the 48.1% is the other way around. What that suggests to me, again, is there is balance. Jesus was good at teaching. He spent a lot of time teaching, but he also spent a lot of time doing other things, practical ministries, healing the hurting who were sick physically, who were sick emotionally, mentally, who were sick spiritually. Jesus spent time, and he was balanced in that approach. Now, whether this was deliberate or unconscious on the part of the gospel writers, I'm not sure, but we believe that the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit, and so somehow that seems to me to be an authorized indication of the balance in Jesus' life. Over the church history, we have had two kinds of Christianity, or two emphases within Christianity. We have had those who had a focus on the teaching part, the preaching, the theologians, and it sort of represents the spiritual part, the evangelism. And then we have the other side who have focused on the social, the helping, the hurting, and digging wells, and those kinds of things. And there's been this tension all throughout church history about how to balance those things. In fact, about 100 years ago, there was a serious split on these. And we have the fundamentalists in the traditional sense of the word who focus on the fundamentals of the faith and the preaching and teaching and theology. And then we had those who promoted the social gospel, we called it, on the other hand. And the twain never met. They both accused each other of misrepresenting Jesus. I think that Brother Avery and I know what side we were on. We believed that Christian work was preaching, teaching. That's what God called you to do. Yeah, we kind of believed in, it's all right, send well diggers over to do mission work or hospitals, but that was always supporting the evangelist. Because the evangelists and the theologians and the teachers of the Bible, they were the real missionaries, and everybody else was sort of supportive missionaries. Is that the kind of the way we... maybe that's no longer true, but that's the way Brother Avery and I were raised. In other words, almost the total focus of our Christianity was on the spiritual part of the gospel message. We listened carefully to the teachings of Jesus. We loved those red letters. We loved the stories about the deeds of Jesus, but we were convinced they were simply supporting his message. And we didn't like those social gospel people. You know, they did leprosy ministry and they started hospitals and they didn't even believe in being born again hardly. They just were kind of foolish people. It seemed to us that compassionate ministries was an end in themselves. What really matters is going to heaven. And that's why we evangelize, to go to heaven. And yeah, life could be tough. You know, not everybody likes us. They laugh at us sometimes. But it's worth it because it will be worth it all when we see Jesus. That's our philosophy. In fact, we were encouraged by Jesus' statement. It said, what good is it if a man gain the whole world and yet lose his soul? This verse convinced us that the soul was far more important than the body. And after all, did not Paul say bodily exercise profiteth, you got to get the F in there, profiteth little, but godliness is profitable in all things. Now, I recognize I may be overstating here just a little bit, but I think even in the Bible we have hyperbole. When we believed and practiced this kind of Christianity, I believe we were kind of like a one-arm boxer. You know, I would hate to be in a boxing match when one man has two and I only have one. We were strong with that right hand. I mean, we were good with that right hand. But that left hand was just tied to our body. And we didn't do much with it. However, over the last few years, I have become convinced that our God is a holistic God. I've become convinced that redemption goes beyond just the soul. God is the creator of this whole world. God is interested in the environment. Do you hear what I'm saying? It is a sin against God to pollute the air and to disgrace his earth. I believe he made these bodies. Of course we know the body is not as important as the soul, but after all, God made this body, and Jesus spent a lot of time fixing up broken bodies. Certainly God is concerned about truth and is very interested that we communicate truth of the kingdom as clearly and forcibly as we can. However, when Jesus went to Nazareth and spoke at the synagogue, he started with what some people might consider his life verse. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord. Our tendency is to spiritualize all of that. Say, well, he was talking about we're going to be saved. We're going to be filled with the Spirit of God. I've taken a new look at that. If you just go down and read what follows after Jesus was casting out demons, he was healing the sick. He was helping people who were needy. He was blessing the poor. He was feeding hungry people. That's what he was doing. In other words, he was preaching and teaching, but he was also setting the sick and the blind and the handicapped free. Jesus demonstrated a love not just for the souls of those people, but a love for their bodies and their emotions and their relationships. Jesus' ministry reflects the fact that God is concerned about the handicapped. He's concerned about the poor, the vulnerable, and the downtrodden. He is not pleased when people wallow in poverty and suffer deprivation and discrimination because of their handicaps. I have a good friend in Lagos who pastors a large church. And he went into a place where he used to go to school, and it had become a terrible slum, horrible slum. And he started weeping at seeing what has happened. And so he got his church involved, and they did lots of things, which is far beyond my time to tell you about it. And I was doing some research, and I asked him, why did you do that? And he says, God is embarrassed by what he sees in that slum. It is a disgrace to God Almighty for us who are Christians, who love God, to allow his world to fall into such wretched conditions. We have done these kinds of works to win their souls, but I hope you listened to what our brother said this morning. Why must we be committed to resurrecting those girls? It is not just to win their souls. They are made in the image of Christ, and whatever is made in the image of Christ is worth redemption. Well, 20 minutes. John captures this balance very well in 1 John 3:17, where he says, if anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue only, but in actions and truth. Now, the question is, how does all this apply to missions? How can we develop and maintain balance in our missionary work A balance between preaching the gospel, the teaching, the truth, the spiritual, and practical doing things. Helping the hurting, alleviating poverty, cleaning up the environment, rescuing these poor girls who've been in slavery. As my friend said, it is an embarrassment to God. How does this truth apply to us? Now, just a couple of preliminary statements. First, understand no one can do everything exactly like Jesus did. Jesus had that perfect balance. And even though he told us we would do the same things that he would do, nobody has been able to quite do everything that Jesus has done. In addition, the Apostle Paul states clearly that God has given some people gifts. And some of those gifts apply to the spiritual part, the teaching part. Others apply to physical part, healing. And so we recognize that the truth is in what all of us do, not necessarily what any one of us does as an individual. So some may be more capable of doing spiritual ministries, that's fine, but there must be balance. So I'm not calling for us to abandon our specialties. I have also been an advocate over the years that the sharper the focus of any ministry, the more likelihood of success. I don't necessarily advocate that every missionary organization do every kind of work. There are organizations, especially my own organization, is highly specialized. We don't apologize for that. However, let me just make a couple of general applications as we conclude. First of all, to the church in general. It seems clear from the scriptures that I have discussed and from the overall emphasis of the New Testament that God is calling the church to preach the gospel of the kingdom and to also heal the sick. I think you would agree with me. Did the early church have that balance? Well, Peter preached the gospel on the day of Pentecost. However, and there's 7 sermons in the book of Acts. However, the church was also involved in healing the sick. Right there that we just read about it. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to everyone as he had need. They were addressing needs. The first internal problem in the church was not over whether or not they would help the poor widows in Jerusalem, but how they would do it. It was simply assumed that they would help those widows in Acts chapter 6. One of Paul's first responsibilities after he linked up with Barnabas was to take gifts from the church at Antioch to the people in Jerusalem who were experiencing a famine. That means that we, the worldwide body of Christ, should be concerned about theology and ministry, about communication and applying these things. That means that our individual denominations should be involved in preaching of the gospel, but we should also be concerned about the poor, the hungry, the people suffering from HIV, and all of these things. That is our responsibility, our corporate responsibility. That means that God's Bible school, whose primary responsibility will always be teaching, should also find a way for her students and staff to be engaged in healing the sick kinds of ministries so that we can have balance in our thinking. Our ministries are incomplete and unhealthy if we only use one arm. So we ask you, individually, and your organizations, do you have the same kind of balance in your church that Jesus had in his ministry? What about to us pastors and missionaries, my missionary colleagues here? If there ever is a group of people who focuses on the gospel part, it's preachers. That's what we do. We are preachers. We are teachers. The average preacher has gone to school many years to learn how to properly interpret the Bible and then properly communicate the Bible. Paul was a professional communicator. We can learn a lot from him. But the question we face, and perhaps the temptation we face, is that we as individuals are often too narrowly focused on the preaching of the gospel of the kingdom part. We spend many hours studying and writing, but do we ever do anything to help the sick and the needy and the hurting? Is there time in your busy schedule to demonstrate the practical love of Christ? Have we been used of God to deliver people from oppression of the evil one and the depression that comes from it? Have we looked around us at the hungry people and tried to help some of them? Have we viewed the sick and disabled as unfortunate people who are somebody else's problem? Have we viewed poor people, particularly those coming to us for help, as a nuisance? How often have we left our offices and pulpits to go to homes and hospitals and hospices to show the gospel, the practical side of the gospel of Christ? I'll tell you a secret from the life of Jesus. Jesus got the attention of unbelievers more quickly with his compassionate ministries than he did his profound teachings. We could learn from his example. Let me just conclude by telling you how God has brought me on this journey. I don't think there's anybody in Nigeria, certainly an academic, a Christian academic, has been more focused on the preaching of the gospel, good news side, than I was in Nigeria. I preached average of the last 10 years, probably 70, 75 times per year. It's almost a joke in our organization that I've created so many projects in Nigeria, and most of them are focused on teaching and preaching and workshops to build and strengthen people spiritually. I've written a lot of books. That's communication. All this relates to information. However, God is a very wise God, and he knows what we need. And he sends things along that we don't even like. Living in Africa has forced me to be more concerned about other people. For example, it happens all the time. Someone shows up at my house in this past week. They have a need. Their child is in the hospital. In fact, I kept track one day for 8 days. So a university security guard came to request money because his family was hungry and their money no reach. Their money had finished. The month had not finished. A former prostitute named Cynthia, who was HIV positive, came to request money for me so she could go back to her village and die. All she wanted was transportation. A former student named Jibu came to request money for his wedding. He's getting married. My neighbor's brother came to request money for his children's education. One of my employees got sick. We had to buy him medicine. One of my former employees' sons came to me requesting money for transportation so he could go to the college and collect his statement of results. A university messenger claimed that his 2 children were sick and in the hospital. He didn't have money. What do? When you see them coming, do you go hide? You not open the door? Were some of these making this up? Perhaps. But how do you know? We do have to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. You cannot give everybody who asks you for something, but you have to help somebody. There are hurting people. I don't have a budget to do these things. It comes out of my pocket. But Jesus says to me, yeah, it's good to preach the gospel. You do a lot of that. But you need to heal the sick. These are sick people. These are needy people. And you need to help them. In 1969, it became obvious to me and the rest of the world, we were hoping that HIV/AIDS would bypass us in West Africa. It didn't. And the statistics became alarming. I dawned on me one time when I was, you may have heard that today there was a bombing in Potiskum in Nigeria, 48 at a school, 48 young students were killed. I was holding a workshop right just down the road from Potiskum. And as I drove home, 5 hours home, the Lord just clearly laid on my heart, you have a lot of experience working with the Minister of Education. This is a medical problem, but it also has a spiritual component. Nigeria has religious education. If we can create a curriculum that can be taught by the religious teachers that will stress abstinence, we can. And by the time I got home, I was fully convinced that this is what I had to do. I'm a preacher. You know, HIV/AIDS in this country at that time was a homosexual issue. Nobody in America, hardly, at least in the evangelical community, it was them. Let it kill them. But Jesus healed the sick. And he didn't go around and necessarily question, are you born again? Can I? No, they were just sick. We have a huge problem in Nigeria. That was a problem when Brother Avery and I were small. That's no longer a problem in this country, and you can get out on your knees and thank God for it. It's the problem of polio. We're one of the 3 countries in the world that still has polio. And it cripples children by the hundreds. And you see them in Nigeria crawling on the ground, scooting on their bottom, walking literally on their hands. I was holding a workshop one day for teachers of Christian religious knowledge. There was about 150 teachers there. And a young man literally walked in on his hands. He had wooden blocks, and he's all 4, dragging his feet behind him. And he had become a teacher of Christian religious knowledge. And his principal said, oh, there's a workshop going on. So he pedaled across town in his little tricycle. And he became my student in our workshop, and we got to know him. And he had one of these old tricycles made out of bicycle parts that he'd used for 19 years, and it was falling apart. And my friend who was helping me was interested in helping us, found out for $100 he could buy him a new one. So he bought this young man a new tricycle, and he took a little video, and he went home and he showed it, and other people were interested. And so he came back, and the next year we bought 2-3 more handicapped people. You see, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rotary Club, they are spending millions and millions of dollars to vaccinate people. And we thank God, but almost nobody is helping the polio victims, the survivors. And I didn't even hardly know about it, but now I find myself involved in helping polio. We eventually built a little shop. Right now we have about 35 employees. We are building about 150 of these wheelchairs a week. We have given out 10,000 of them. No handicapped person has ever paid 1 cent for one of these. I love to preach. I enjoy preaching. But when I go and we give away these wheelchairs, and I see these little children crawling on the ground and getting up in that wheelchair, they usually have strong arms, and now they can pedal themselves to school. My joy is complete. I get the joy of preaching and talking to them and challenging these young people, but I get the joy of knowing that I helped make that happen. We have lots of violence in my country. Lots of it. I'm sure I've heard more gunfire than most soldiers in Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm sure I've seen more black smoke than most people have seen in wars. And again, God impressed on me. To whom much is given, much is expected. You have a lot of Muslim friends on the other side. You better get involved in this. And so I've been involved the last few years in peacemaking. I'm a preacher, not a peacemaker. But Jesus was the Prince of Peace. And somehow I have found comfort and I found satisfaction out of maybe dropping one or two preaching engagements and going and preparing a presentation on peacemaking. I've even been invited by Muslim organizations to come and present to them. And I think I would just about as soon do that as preach to a Christian congregation, trying to bring about peace. Becoming involved in compassion and ministries has changed me. Although I've always been a practical person, I'm even more so now. I'm less interested, to be honest, in purely theoretical or theological issues. When I was younger, we used to love to debate all kinds of issues. I don't get too excited about that anymore. But I'm a richer person. I see and appreciate things better. I am more relevant to the society. I'm trying to follow Jesus in preaching the gospel, but also healing the sick. During my first 12 or 15 years in Nigeria, I probably spent 99% of my time preaching the gospel. I don't know where we are now, but it's a little bit more balanced up. And I think I am better for it. And my ministry is better for it. The Apostle Peter wrote, "To this were you called, because Christ suffered you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." And Paul said, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." According to these verses and according to what Jesus said to his disciples that he was sending out for their student practice, we should be imitating him. We should have the same balance in our ministries that he has. Yes, we always want to preach the gospel. But the new thing God has been teaching me is it's good mission work to heal the sick as well. Because our God is a redeemer. He likes to take that which is broken and fix it. He likes to take that which is stained and dark and destroyed and make it whole. That's the kind of God we serve. So, how balanced are you? How balanced is your church? How balanced is your missionary organization? I challenge you, even you who are learning to be preachers, and I pray you will be the best preachers in the world, that sometime while you're here at GBS, that God will help you to go down to some of those slums and go and do something practical to help God redeem this society. God bless you all.
We're glad you joined us. God's Bible School and College prepares students for lives of ministry wherever God calls them. This content is possible because of the generous support of friends like you. To support GBSC, visit giving.gbs.edu. Thank you.